Well, we're joined now by Sam Marsden to talk Marcus Rashford and El Clasico this weekend, of course. Sam, has Marcus Rashford exceeded expectations in Barcelona so far?
It's a good question. Difficult one to answer, obviously, because we're so early in the season. What he's certainly exceeded in terms of expectations is game time. Obviously, circumstances perhaps sort of not to do with his performance time, but to do with the injuries that we've had at Barcelona. Obviously, Rafinha's out at the moment. Lamine Yamal's missed a lot of games. Lewandowski's missed a few games. Ferran Torres is also injured now. So he's effectively become, in these first 11 games, Barca's only ever present striker. He's the only forward who's played all 11 games. He's one of only 4 players that have featured in all 4 games. I think he's 4th or 5th in terms of minutes, and he's done quite well. He's set up and scored more goals than any other Barca player. I think it's 7 after 11 games. I'd argue it's 8. There was one against Getafe, which didn't go down as assist, which was for me was very much an assist. Obviously, that Newcastle performance stands out. The big goal was a really nice goal against Sevilla. But I think, if you dig a little bit deeper, he's probably just about par. He has been quite good. He's had moments with the ball. He's really good, really direct. Barca want a little bit more without the ball in terms of, not just from him. He's a bit unfortunate in this regard because Barca's whole level in terms of pressing, the demands that sort of Flick puts on those front players has dropped off a little bit this season, and he's in a team that's constantly changing. But that's one area where Flick and Barca really want, not just Rashford, but the whole team to improve, especially ahead of this weekend's big game against Real Madrid.
Now, you've obviously written a piece about Rashford for ESPN, which I've read, which is great. And I was interested in the fact that he's living in the mountains. I'm curious to know if that was a conscious decision by Barcelona to put him up there, because, difficult subject to get into, but Marcus Rashford's had his off-field issues. We know that, he got caught by the papers drinking in Belfast. He's had problems with city life in the past, shall we say. So I'm interested in that kind of element of it. Do you know how that came about that he ended up living up there?
Yeah, I mean, obviously the mountains might sound more remote and sort of discreet than it actually is. You've obviously got in Barcelona, you've kind of got quite a small sort of city compressed in between sort of the mountains and the sea. So within sort of 10-minute drive, he's down sort of in Castelldefels as well, where there is the beach and stuff and restaurants. More of a sort of a quiet town, not like a big city like Barcelona. But like you say, Barcelona players tend to kind of have two choices. They kind of live where Marcus is living. He's actually in an urbanization which is not famous for loads of footballers living in. They actually live in a different part of Castelldefels, or they live sort of uptown in Barcelona. And like you say, maybe you've got more distractions and stuff there. As far as I know, it wasn't anything to do with the club. It was completely Rashford's decision. It's a new house, which he's the first person to ever rent. So he's renting there at the moment. I don't know how long he plans to stay there, if it's a short-term rental, if he does want to move into the city. But yeah, it's quite a sort of area which is popular with footballers. But yeah, outside the city perhaps is important. But no, it wasn't anything that was to do with the club. I don't think the club sort of were worried about that sort of side of things of him coming to the club now.
So there's a really interesting line in your piece as well about his Rashford sprint stats since he went to Barcelona. I mean, they've rapidly improved on the Premier League last year. And I think one criticism that Rashford's had in recent seasons is that, he doesn't work hard enough. And that's the stat that you mentioned suggests that he does. And I think if he is going to survive at Barcelona, those sprint stats and his pressing stats need to be maintained at a high level, don't they? Because we've seen in the past when he drops off, it's very obvious that Marcus Rashford isn't pulling his weight, and his body language isn't great. So have you seen his body language improve? Does he look like he's a bit more enthused by the fact that he's playing for Barcelona and that's helping him in his sprint stats and everything else be positive?
Yeah, definitely. But I think there is not so much from Barcelona, but, people like yourself, people that have covered Rashford, people, English fans, Manchester United fans are wary of the fact that, this is an 11-game sample. You come to Barcelona, you've got a point to prove. People at Manchester United would have said in the past, once he signed his contract, perhaps he dipped off, etc. So there's sort of a wariness that this is still sort of the honeymoon phase, if you will. But I was, like you say, those sprinting stats, they were increased so much that it was sort of quite surprising when I put in the request for them. I thought perhaps, given the honeymoon factor, the flick factor in terms of what he wants from his players, in terms of that high intensity, they would be up, but not. I mean, I think it was sort of 18.9 sort of high intensity sprints he was averaging per game in the Premier League. I don't have the numbers to hand, and it's up already sort of doubled towards sort of 40 this season per 90 minutes with Barcelona. Still a long way short of what, Rafinha especially was producing last season for Barcelona. But if he's going to click under Flick, and this is what Flick spoke about, he's been a little bit sort of wary in terms of bigging up Rashford too much, because I think we've probably all been guilty of in the past, not with Rashford, but with all players. Players have a good performance and you're like, well, amazing, brilliant, etc. And after that Newcastle game, he was a little bit like, this is the first step. What we need to see now is more intensity, the stuff, off the ball, buy into sort of the system, the way that Barcelona are playing. And I think that's specifically true with Rashford, like you say, in terms of, how he sort of perhaps looked or his body language in the past when he's been in England. But it is also true, to be fair to Marcus, to all of the Barcelona forwards this season, that energy, that intensity just dipped a little bit. And that's what Flick really wants to get back.
Mark, you the fact that Marcus Rashford has started pretty well puts him into a category with Scott McTominay, with perhaps Rasmus Højlund, Anthony maybe, players who've seemed to have rediscovered themselves and found a bit of form after they've left United. So 2 questions. 1, what does that say about United? And 2, do you see any world in which, if he has a really good season at Barcelona, I think there's an option, not an obligation, to make the deal permanent. So could he revive his career at Old Trafford?
Well, on the first point, I've got to chuck in Victor Lindelof and Jadon Sancho as well, who are doing nothing at Aston Villa. So it's not all kind of rosy for players who leave Man United. No, McTominay went to great team in Napoli, easy league, Serie A, had a great season. Maybe the same with Højlund, but I think Rashford's kind of a unique case because we all know that he's got all the talent in the world, fantastic pace, can score great goals. I mean, there's so many great goals that you can see of Marcus Rashford. He'd had probably the best YouTube reel in the world outside Lamine Yamal and Lionel Messi, but he doesn't do it often enough. And I think that's why it got to the point at United where they'd given up on him. They'd given up on him on the pitch and off the pitch as well. There were incidents where a lot of incidents really where he just let himself down and was in trouble with the club. So he's got 2.5 years left on his contract. It expires in 2028. And look, the only way that he's going to go back to Man United is if Ruben Amorim leaves and a manager comes in that wants Marcus Rashford. I think there's no real likelihood that he goes back there. So United are hopeful that he continues to do well at Barcelona and prompts them to sign him on that relatively inexpensive €30 million option. And if he doesn't, I think if he does well enough at Barcelona, his stock will be high enough for another club to take him off United's hands. So I think he'll leave no matter what. But I just think that Sam's right. You have to be a little bit wary of Marcus Rashford because he has highs and lows. But I think the fact is that Barcelona, he's looking around the dressing room and thinking, I actually belong here. Looking at people like Yamal and Lewandowski and Rafinha, thinking that this is what he wanted for so many years at United, players that he felt could actually take him to another level. And in his defence, I think United let him down too often, whereby they brought too many players in who weren't good enough. And he was a star player with all the pressure on his shoulders, and he was playing amongst a squad of players that just weren't ever good enough to deliver the expectations that United had. But I think he will leave. But I just want to chuck one to you, James, before we go back to Sam. Thomas Tuchel's had him in his squads quite regularly as England manager, but he also is quite critical as well about that Marcus hasn't quite delivered on what his potential is, and he's giving him the hard stick, isn't he? So, do you think he'll make the World Cup squad on the basis that Tuchel likes him, but he wants more from him?
As it stands, no. I don't think he will. He does like him, and he likes the fact that he obviously could potentially play through the middle if there was ever to be an issue with Harry Kane. I think if Harry Kane was suddenly ruled out of the tournament, I think that would enhance Rashford's case. Not that I'm saying that he's the second choice number 9, but the fact that he could do both is obviously of massive value. No, I just feel as though there are other players who are ahead of him in those positions. I think Anthony Gordon has really made that left side his own at the moment. I think he's it's his to lose really over the next sort of several months for England. And then you've got other players that he's got to try and get into the team. Whether he looks at putting Phil Foden out there. We've had the Bellingham debate on this podcast already. Cole Palmer, obviously those players can play centrally and prefer to play centrally. I'm not sure that Rashford is going to be anything more than a 20, 30 minutes off the bench option. And I think there are enough of those. It's more likely that a Jack Grealish could move ahead of Rashford. If he has a great year, then obviously, things could change and he could force his way in. But I think if they sort of all continue along their current trajectory, I'm not sure he makes it. That, of course, is another issue for another day. Sam, can I ask you just about Sunday and El Clasico? Obviously, Barcelona, Real Madrid. How do you see the balance between those two sides at the moment? And how will Hansi Flick, not being in the dugout, affect Barcelona?
Yeah, no, Hansi Flick, he was obviously sent off against Girona at the weekend, so he won't be on the touchline. I I don't think it will have a major effect. Obviously, he'll be up watching the game from a box or something somewhere as he's in for the pre-match and that sort of stuff. But it's a really sort of interesting game. Obviously, Barcelona completely dominated Real Madrid last year. They had 4 wins out of 4, Copa del Rey final, Super Copa final. They had a big win in the Santiago Bernabeu at the start of the season. But the margins were so fine. I mean, I know people get bored of talking about Barcelona's high line, etc. But, there were a couple of offsides against Mbappe, which were so marginal, and Barca pulled them off because they were playing well at the time. They had Inigo Martinez, Marshall in the defence, and that's not been the feeling that they're sort of all in tune defensively at the moment. In the first half against Girona on Saturday, Girona, after equalising at 1-1, got in 3 or 4 times and could easily have been 3-1. It wouldn't have been an exaggeration to say, Girona could have been 3-1, 4-1 up at the break with the chances they had, hitting the post through Porto, a good chance for Bryan Hill as well. And those flaws have been exploited in many games this season. They lost to Sevilla 4-1 before the international break. Back at the end of August, there was another one against Rayo Vallecano. They drew 1-1. Could easily have lost. So there's a lot of sort of hope for Madrid, especially with Mbappe in such great form. I think it's 10 successive games he's scored in for club and country. But on the flip side, Real Madrid aren't actually that impressive either. They struggled against Getafe on Sunday. It took a late Mbappe goal after Getafe had been reduced to 10 men and later 9 men. There's a feeling that they're still sort of not quite playing as Xabi Alonso wants them to. But I think Real Madrid probably slightly have the edge because they're at home, because they're not giving up the chances that Barca are giving up. Barca are a team that are missing a few players. Lewandowski's out, Dani Olmo's out. Ferran Torres and Rafinha, neither of them have trained on Monday. Neither of them are expected to be available for Olympiacos. So even if they are available for the Clásico on Sunday, it's, coming in from the cold after long injuries, perhaps potentially as players off the bench. So you're looking at also Lamine Yamal, who's just come back from a groin injury. So I think the favourites are probably just about Real Madrid. They're obviously top, 2 points clear going into the game. They've got a few less injury problems. Defensively, they've got a few, but yeah, it's going to be interesting. The feeling around both teams is that neither of them are at anywhere near the level they should be for this stage of the season.
Well, it's always a must-watch game, even if they're not quite at their best. Sam, thanks for joining us. Thanks also to Mark and to Beth. This has been the Football Reporters. We'll see you again soon.